We're going to look at, I would imagine if we did a poll of what's your favorite parable, this would rank high, if not the highest on the list. We're going to Luke chapter 10, and we're going to talk about the Good Samaritan this morning. The Good Samaritan is, of course, known very well, but it's deceptively simple. It's very deep, and every time I go to it, I learn something new. And I hope that will be the case for you this morning. We're going to look at it in terms of how to love others. And so before we get to it, I like to do background into the parables. Before we get to the parable itself, I want to do a little background in the way Jesus taught love. And of course, he said that our identity should be in loving God. And so think about that first. As Christians, we should be known as people who love God. The greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. But when he talked about how people would recognize us, he said they will recognize you by your love for one another. Let's go to John 13, 34 and 35. This is the new commandment that Jesus gave to his disciples. And the commandment is that you love one another just as I've loved you. Now, love is in the Old Testament, so the new commandment is not simply to love people, but to love people as Jesus loved us. See, the world had not seen that sacrificial example until he came into the world. And so that is the sense in which it is new. Love one another just as I've loved you. You also are to love one another. And then he says, by this, all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. So our identity is in loving God, but the way people will know our love or know that we are God's people is our love for one another. Is there some kind of contradiction here? I think there's an easy explanation. It looks like he might be promoting the second greatest commandment over the first. When Jesus was asked to rank them, he said in Matthew 22, the first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second is to love your neighbor as yourself. But there's a really good reason why he makes loving others the identifying characteristic for Christian people. And that is by showing love to others, we demonstrate a higher love that necessarily resides in our heart in order to love others. In other words, if you don't love God first, you can't properly love other people. So by loving others, we're demonstrating our love for God. And it's really the only way we can really demonstrate that. We can talk about it, but talk can be empty. Talk is often cheap, and it's actions that show who we truly are. And that takes us to 1 John chapter 4. Let's look at verses 20 and 21 of 1 John chapter 4. Look at this. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. I think it was last week we talked about Mark chapter 2 when Jesus healed the paralytic, and he asked the question, which is easier to say your sins are forgiven, or to say to this man, take up your mat and walk? And the easier thing to say would be your sins are forgiven, because there's no evidential proof that that actually occurred. You have to take Jesus' word for it that the man's sins are forgiven. But if he says, take up your mat and walk, well, we're going to see whether his words have power or not. And of course, the man took up his mat and walked and proved that Jesus had the power to forgive sins. This is kind of a similar situation where it's easier to say, I love God, than to say, I love my brother. God is invisible. And of course, we do actions to show our love for God, our worship, for example. However, worship can be very hollow. You can be singing on the outside, and your heart could be in a very different place. And we can be hypocritical in our worship. But your love for your brother shows because you have a physical world in which to demonstrate that. And John is saying, if you're saying you love God, but you hate your brother through your actions, you're a liar. Because people who love God are going to love God's children. Whenever we become Christians, we enter into a family, right? And in this family, we have brothers and sisters who also belong to our Father. And He loves them as He loves us. When we mistreat them, He takes that personally. Do you parents like it when somebody mistreats your child? How would you like it if somebody just jerked your child up and yelled at them and was very abusive to them and said to you, hey, no offense, he's just getting on my nerves? How would you feel about that? Oh, that's fine. I know you love me. No, you're going to be very upset with somebody who would treat your child that way. So when we mistreat and abuse one another, how do you think God feels about that? He does not feel loved when we hate one another, because a parent is defensive about his child, and a parent is connected to his child, and the way people treat his child, they're treating him. So loving others demonstrates your love for God. And it also demonstrates your love for yourself. You know, Jesus said the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And this is a little tricky. We've always taught love yourself first, and then you can love others. But that can go too far. It can enter into self-centeredness and narcissism, and we're to put ourselves last and be sacrificial and serve others. So self-love can go too far. There is a way that we ought to think about ourselves. Paul says in Romans 12, verse 3, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but think with sober judgment. So, sober judgment, though, recognizes that you have value, you have worth, and only those people who recognize their own value and worth are capable of loving other people. Another way to put it is the misanthropes that hate others and mistreat others often don't think very highly of themselves either. And so we learn how to love others through loving God and loving ourselves. That makes you someone capable of showing compassion and interest in others and love in others. You develop that muscle through your self-love and your love for God. And of course, love for God is primary in that list. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10, is about love. And it's about showing love to other people. Let's go over to Luke 10 now and get the immediate background. You've kind of got a general background. Behind all of Jesus' teachings is this concept of loving God and demonstrating your love for God by loving others, the greatest commands. Now we come to Luke 10. Let's get the immediate context. 2 questions. A scribe comes to Jesus with a question. Now, who are the scribes? Anybody give me a quick definition of a scribe? Yes, experts of the law of Moses. Sometimes they're called a lawyer. In fact, that's what he's called in the ESV here in verse 25, a lawyer. This was a scribe, an expert in the law of Moses, put Jesus to the test, Luke says. And he asks this question, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Being a scribe, we know that he already thinks he knows the answer to this question. So everybody in the audience knows, Jesus knows, the scribe himself knows that he thinks he knows the answer to this question. So he's not asking the question for information. As Luke says, he's putting Jesus to the test. Apparently there were lots of debates in those days over this question. And the scribes were constantly ranking commandments and talking about how many commandments have to be followed in order to be right with God. And it was all about rule keeping. And they liked to ask Jesus questions that the answer would put him on the other side of somebody no matter what he answered. So there were powerful people on both sides of this issue. If Jesus stepped into the ring on this debate, he would make enemies immediately. And Jesus was constantly having to deal with this. They wanted to discredit him and get him out of the way. So this is one of those minefield questions. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Whatever he says is going to be the wrong answer with somebody. So Luke says that he was testing Jesus, and Jesus answered the question with another question, which is a very smart way to deal with people who have ulterior motives. He says, verse 26, what is written in the law? You're a lawyer. How do you read it? And so now the man is put on the spot, and he answers the question. Verse 27, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And that's probably the answer Jesus would have given. In fact, we know from Matthew 22, it is the answer Jesus would have given. And so Jesus says in verse 28, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. I wasn't there, but I have a picture in my mind of how that conversation went. I see a huge crowd of people around Jesus. I see Jesus very busy. He's a patient man, but the scribe has ulterior motives. And so, how do you picture? I picture him saying, you've answered correctly, do this and you will live. Now, back to what I was saying, turning his back to the man or trying to get back into his teaching, but the man is not done yet. Luke says, verse 29, desiring to justify himself, he asks a second question. So Jesus embarrassed him because he was trying to test him, and Jesus easily handled this question. Not only that, but he drew the answer to the question out of the man. So he failed to discredit him. And maybe others have put him up to this. Maybe the Sanhedrin sent him out there to do a job, and it's not done yet, so he's got to justify himself. He gets defensive, and he asks a second question. And the question is, who is my neighbor? Now again, this is a question that no doubt was surrounded by a lot of controversy. What the controversy was, Luke doesn't tell us here, but by Jesus' answer, it had to involve racism, the strife between the Jews and Samaritans. Love your neighbor as yourself. We understand that to mean love everyone. But if you didn't want to love everyone, all you had to do was change the definition of neighbor and make it say everyone who's just like me, or everyone that goes to my congregation, or in the Jews' version, everyone who's not a tax collector, a sinner, or a Gentile. And then that commandment becomes very easy to follow. Love my neighbor. My neighbor's my family. I love my family. There you go. I get eternal life. So they messed with the definition of neighbor in order to justify themselves. And so he knows if Jesus says, your neighbor is everyone, and he knows that's what Jesus thinks, if he says that, there are going to be a lot of people who are angry with him. So this second question was tougher than the first. And it called for a more nuanced, a deeper answer. In other words, it called for a parable. So Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. Let's read it starting in Luke chapter 10, verse 30. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." This is the origin of our understanding of the word Samaritan. Parables had a tremendous effect on the language we use. For example, when you think of a talent today, your first thought is not currency. You think of abilities, right? That comes from the parable of the talents, in which a talent was currency that represented the ability of the servant. People get confused reading back our meaning of talent into the parable that basically gave us that meaning. They said, did he give them abilities? No, he gave them money, but because that money was attached to their abilities, today we think of talents as abilities. Same is true with Samaritan. Don't read your modern day idea of Samaritan into this parable, because today being a good Samaritan is a great thing. It's a compliment. There are all these charitable organizations that use the term Samaritan in a positive, benevolent way. That was not the meaning at all in the first century. In fact, it was a derogatory term, and the Jews hated the Samaritans. But the Samaritan's not the villain of the story. Instead, the villains of the story are a priest and a Levite. Priests were descendants of Aaron who were consecrated for temple service. They were considered the holiest among God's people. Likewise, Levites were of the tribe of Levi. Not all Levites were priests, but all priests were Levites. Aaron being of the tribe of Levi. However, all the Levites were also given special service in the temple. And if you know the Old Testament, you know the Levites did not have a land possession, but they belonged to God, and so they were God's special tribe consecrated for holy service. So these were representatives of the holiest among God's people, and he made them the villains. So he made the most hated man in Israel the hero, and he made the people who were supposed to be the holiest, he made them villains in the story. And so here we come to another question. After he tells the parable, that I think is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into the details and try to explain what happened. I think it's pretty plain. You've heard it all your lives. But he asks this question. There are 3 people in the parable. Verse 36, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? Now he does something really interesting there. The question wasn't, how can I be a neighbor? The question was, who is my neighbor? The question was of the object of a neighbor. Who do I have to love? And Jesus switched that around, making neighbor the subject. Who is a neighbor? Who proved to be a neighbor? There's so much packed into that question. One thing is, you can't control other people and put them into categories, judge them by appearances. But you do have control over yourself. And you need to stop worrying about what other people are and what they deserve. And you need to start thinking about who you are, because it's the only thing you have control over. Don't ask about the neighbor as an object. Ask about the neighbor as a subject. It's an excellent question. And what he did is he got us thinking about what made this Samaritan a neighbor. Now, he was so good at asking this question that the man had to answer the one who showed him mercy. Notice he didn't say the Samaritan. He couldn't bring himself to say that. That's how much he hated Samaritans. Where is it? John 4, I think, where John tells us the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans, and vice versa. So the man couldn't even say the word. But he admitted that in the story, the Samaritan character was the one who proved to be a neighbor. And Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." And then the man decided he wasn't going to ask him any more questions that day. He was done with the test. Now, I think we would do well for the rest of our time looking at 3 distinguishing features of this Samaritan as an example of loving others, which Jesus terms being a neighbor. And here's the first one. First thing I want you to see is the Samaritan didn't mind being inconvenienced. Now, this is one that hits me right between the eyes. By nature, I like to get up in the morning and know the shape of the day. I like to have a plan. What time do I got to be here? What time do I got to be there? Will I have any free time? Will I have time to do things I want to do? What needs to be done? And of course, the day never works out the way that I planned, but that's my nature. And maybe you're like that. Maybe you're somebody who thrives on chaos. I don't understand you, but there are those kinds of people out there, and you probably do a lot better than us organized people. But, interruptions are part of life. And the Samaritan, he did not mind being inconvenienced. Verse 31, look back at the parable. We'll get into some of the details here. The priest encountered the man by chance. That's the only place in the New Testament where that word is used, the word translated by chance. And what it means, it was purely coincidental that the priest crossed paths with the poor man who lay beside the road on the way to Jericho. And likewise, the Levite encountered the man by accident. You notice verse 32 says, likewise. So in the same way the priest encountered the man by chance, the Levite encountered the man by chance. And then the Samaritan was no different. He came, verse 33, he came across the man as he journeyed. So they weren't just going down this road looking for people who'd been beaten up and left for dead. They were on their way to do something. These were busy men who had appointments. You don't travel this road without good reason. It was a dangerous road. They had to be in Jericho, probably had to be there on a particular time for important business. And here's the lesson. Love rarely arrives on time. Love is hard to schedule. It doesn't pay attention to appointments. It doesn't give you a heads up that it's coming. And that's just not how life works. I would imagine that the priest and the Levite had good things that they were headed for. Maybe they were on their way to preach a sermon, teach the law, do some services at a synagogue or something like that. But they were dispatched from Jerusalem to Jericho for some reason, and they thought it was a pretty good reason, and that's their excuse for not stopping to offer assistance. What they didn't realize is interruptions are signs, not threats of your value. When somebody interrupts your day with a phone call saying, I need some help, that's saying that you're a valuable person. The more interruptions you get, the more people are saying they need you. And what's really sad is when the phone never rings, or you never get that text message, or you never get that request for help. It means people have given up on trying to get any help from you, or they don't really see that you're all that helpful. I try to think about that when the phone rings and interrupts, or the doorbell rings here at the church building, that, somebody thinks they need me, and that's a sign of my value. I need to look at that as a good thing. C.S. Lewis wrote this letter to a man named Arthur Greeves, and he was talking about this and a switch in attitude. And I want to share this with you, these words of wisdom. He said, "The great thing, if one can, is to stop regarding unpleasant things as interruptions as one's own or real life. The truth is, of course, that what one calls interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life God is sending one day by day. What one calls one's real life is a phantom of one's own imagination. This is what I see at moments of insight, but it's hard to remember it all the time." So he says, I don't really live by this, but I know this is true, that real life is composed of interruptions. And this plan that you have for your day when you wake up in the morning, that's a figment of your imagination. That's not real life. It's just a plan. You know what James told us about plans in James 4:13 and following. Got to be careful about that. And we should make our plan saying, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that, because your life is a vapor and you don't know what a day may bring. So that's the first distinction between the Samaritan and the others, is he saw opportunities in interruptions where they saw inconveniences. And he took advantage of the opportunity and used it for God's glory. Here's the second distinction. The Samaritan recognized the humanity in everyone. The man that he helped was a Jew, and he was a Samaritan. We can get a little bit into this antagonism between the Jews and Samaritans. I mentioned John 4, where John tells us that the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. And Jesus spoke with the Samaritan woman at a well. So he broke two taboos. Number one, she was a Samaritan. Number two, she was a woman. And men and women weren't to talk in public like that unless they were married or related in some way. And whenever the disciples returned from wherever they were and saw Jesus talking with this woman, John says they marveled that he talked to them. They were astonished that he was talking to this woman because she was a Samaritan. There's a history behind it. It goes back before the days of Christ. In the 8th century BC, when Assyria destroyed the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Their method was to destroy a place, take the survivors out of that place except for the poorest of the land, and move them to other places of domination, and move in foreigners, and that would keep revolts from being staged or any attempts at trying to regain the kingdom. And so what happened is the foreigners moved in, intermarried with the Israelites who were left there, and as the Jews looked at it, a hybrid race evolved from that, an impure people. And so they didn't like the Samaritans because they didn't feel they were true Israelites. They felt the 10 tribes were lost. Now, another part of this is the Samaritans had built a rival temple on a place called Mount Gerizim in their territory. And a lot of this came out of reaction to the way the Jews were behaving. The Jews wouldn't allow them to worship at their temple. They treated them like Gentiles. They still believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They wanted a temple of their own. They built one. That, of course, was against the law. And the Jews used that as another reason. The Jews didn't like the Samaritans didn't like the Jews. It was so bad that when the Jews wanted to travel to Samaria, they went 2 days out of their way to avoid it when they wanted to travel north. If you can picture the map of Israel in your mind, you have Galilee in the north, you have Judah with Jerusalem in the south, and in between is Samaria. And so instead of going straight as the crow flies to Galilee when they needed to travel between Jerusalem and Galilee, they would cross the Jordan River east, go up through a region called Perea, and then cross the Jordan River again to get to Galilee. Jesus in Luke 9 wanted to travel through Samaria and stay in one of the villages of the Samaritans, and the people of Samaria wouldn't allow him and the disciples to stay there because they were Jews. So you see the antagonism went both ways. And that's when James and John were so angry, and they asked Jesus, should we call fire down from heaven to consume them? The sons of thunder, they had this anger toward the Samaritans. And of course, Jesus rebuked them for that. And they went on to another village. So the antagonism was felt. And there was no need in those days to go into that kind of background to understand how radical this parable was, that the hero was a Samaritan. And to show how unusual it was that he looked at a Jew and saw not just a Jew, but a human being, and he felt compassion for him. He saw the humanity in everyone. He recognized the truth that Paul preached to the Athenians on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17, verse 26. God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. From Adam and Eve, we all have come. That's how Luke begins his gospel account, saying that Jesus came not just from Abraham, but he came from Adam as we all came from Adam. We're all human beings. And we're working on, I don't think we've gotten there, but we're working on erasing those distinctions and recognizing each other equally as human beings. But at the same time, we're dividing up in other ways. Our technology divides us. Everything is personal now in terms of our communication, our entertainment. If you go into a public area, people don't talk to each other anymore. They're staring at their little phone and maybe have their earbuds in, and they're shutting the world out. And so we may not have trouble seeing one another because of race, although I think that problem's still around. But in addition to that, we're not seeing each other because we're looking into our phone and we're not seeing the world around us. We may not see somebody in need if we would even help them. Third distinction, I'm running out of time here, and this is the last one. The Samaritan accepted responsibility for others. Have you ever been driving down the road and I've talked about this before. You see somebody who has just had a flat tire or an accident, and you're busy. You're on your way to somewhere. You got an appointment. You got to be there on time, and you just drive by. And what's your thought? You're not thinking, I hate that person. That's not what you're thinking. You're thinking, somebody else will take care of that person. And in some situations, I'm making an illustration here. I know in some situations it's probably true. Like, we have services on 459 and around and toward the center of town that will take care of cars in need. So the best thing probably to do is to call and make sure that what do you call that service? Somebody help me out. ASAP. Make sure that they're on it. That's probably the best thing that you can do. Because it's dangerous, for you to get out on the interstate and try to help somebody change a tire. So let's not, get bogged down in the details here. You know what I'm saying is a lot of times when we can help, we don't help. And it's not because we don't like the people. It's because we figure someone else will take care of it. And there are studies that show this. There was a really interesting study that was done on a Christian campus with seminary students, and they hired an actor to play the role of a homeless person who was needing help. And they put him in between the dorm and the chapel, and they sent these students to the chapel at a certain time to do a lesson on the Good Samaritan. And they found that the students who were left late, they stopped less frequently than the ones who felt like they had plenty of time. So it wasn't necessarily about whether they cared. It was directly tied to how much time they had. They did another study about, a similar thing. They positioned an actor in a particular place, and in some cases, they had a lot of other people around. And where there were a lot of witnesses to this actor falling and needing help, the people they were studying were less likely to help. When they were the only one around, they were more likely to help. Which tells you that most of the time, it's not because we don't like people or we don't see the humanity in them. We just feel like it's not my responsibility. And the Good Samaritan, he could have thought, this man's family will probably be looking for him. The authorities will take care of this. He's a Jew. Let the Jewish people take care of him. I'll get into trouble if I even touch him because Samaritans are not supposed to be in contact with Jews. But no, he saw this man as his responsibility. Whereas the priest and the Levite, they didn't look at it that way. Wendell Berry wrote this story called The Hurt Man. And in this story, a young man named Matt Fellner and his mother are home alone when they're surprised by the intrusion of a wounded man. And Matt's mother lets the man in. And it's one of the first events that Matt remembers because it was the first time he saw true compassion. It says, what he saw in his mother's face would remain with him forever. It was pity, but it was more than that. It was a hurt love that seemed to include entirely the hurt man. It included him and disregarded everything else. It disregarded the aura of whiskey that ordinarily she would have resented. It disregarded the blood puddled on the porch floor and the trail of blood through the hall. It was the first time that he realized and accepted mortality and that grief was a necessary reality and that everyone lying under the grass in the graveyard had once been alive. And Barry says that it was a part of the town's hard history of love. And so I bring that up as we bring this to an end because what compassion is a hurt love. It's a love that costs much. And it takes a lot to repay. And it's inconvenient. It requires you to see others, see yourself in others' shoes, see them as humans. It requires you to take responsibility for others. It'll mess up your day. It'll cost you a lot of money. The Good Samaritan did all of this, but he did it to be a neighbor. The question isn't, who is my neighbor? The question is, how can I be a neighbor to other people? All right, that's all the time we have for today.